So today we're going to talk about Tresa and some of the bulletin information that's come out about part one. And I thought the first thing that we need to do is drill down as to who's who and what the definitions of the people are that are going to be involved in a trade as we move forward. So once we get those down, then we can start expanding a little bit more in Tresa, but this is basic. You have probably heard this before, but we've got some clarifications to it as well. So today we're going to talk about customers, clients, self-represented parties. What does assistance to a self-represented party mean? We're going to glance about information about the RICO information guide and the RICO information and disclosure to self-represented party form. Just as a bit of background, the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act 2002 has been amended. So the act is still in place. It is still the same act, but the amendments are being added to the original act, and the act has now been renamed the Trust in Real Estate Act 2002, or Tresa for short. So that's where we stand today with the legislation. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is customers. Customer service and references to customers are going to be eliminated moving forward. Moving forward, customers do not exist. Try and block that word out of your vocabulary because when we're dealing with the public, they are not customers. Now they're going to be called consumers. So they are the general public until they declare as either a client, a buyer or seller client, or a self-represented party, whether it's a buyer or a seller. So now consumers are just the general public. Once they make a decision whether they're going to be a client or a self-represented party, then you know how to deal with them. So until that point, they are consumer. SRPs, or self-represented parties, do not replace the term customer. You're dealing with them completely differently than you did with customer service. Okay? So consumers must be informed before they make a decision whether they're a client or a self-represented party. So we're going to have to supply and explain the RICO information guide as soon as possible when we are dealing with consumers. Now, here's the little catch. We have not seen the information guide yet, but RICO has promised an online tool to share the guide. We are hoping to have a copy of this guide within a week to 10 days. We've sort of been promised it. But as of right now, we have not seen it. So once we get it, we'll be doing another video on information contained in the guide and how to explain it to the general public. I must admit, we're all being a little bit coy with our information, and that is because we haven't seen anything substantial or in print concerning forms, concerning the information guide. We haven't seen anything in print, and I know that the AREA forms are not going to be available to us until November, I believe it's 28th, and we start using them December the 1st. So we have a little bit of intense reading to do once we do get them. But as of right now, that's where it stands. Customers no longer exist. So here are the transition rules, because there is going to be a transition. Any current customer agreements are going to remain in effect until they expire or until March 30th at the latest. On March 30th, existing customer agreements expire. So during that time, if you do a deal with someone who is under a customer agreement, it will be treated under the current legislation. Okay, current legislation will apply to those agreements that are in effect. Any new agreements that are written as of December the 1st will fall under the new Tresa legislation. The one thing that you cannot do after December the 1st is you cannot amend or extend existing agreements. And that's going to be customer service agreements. If a customer service agreement expires and the agent is still providing customer service after December the 1st, the agent must get a representation agreement, a BRA or a listing agreement signed. Okay. What's the easiest way to explain this? When you're dealing with customers, you are giving them service. So you are technically at that point treating them as what will be a new client. So you will have to get your agreement signed if you're going to continue to work with that consumer. Okay. Clients. Here's a few definitions and how we're going to be working with clients. Clients are represented by the brokerage under a representation agreement, which can be written, oral, or implied in respect of a trade in real estate. Okay, we're not going to talk about designated representation at this time, but this is your definition of a client. They're represented by the brokerage or you as an agent in the brokerage, and your agreement can be written, oral, or implied. Understand that the brokerage and the client must agree that the client will receive services from the brokerage in respect of a trade. All of this has to do with a trade in real estate. Just for your information, you can create agency or representation orally or implied. However, you only get compensated or paid under a written agreement with the brokerage. And that would be a buyer representation agreement or a listing agreement. Those are the only ways you can get paid. Without a written agreement, agents must be cautious in an effort to help a consumer, ensuring they do not give advice or opinions or create implied agency. So when you're dealing with consumers or the general public, you can certainly give general information about real estate, etc. However, you have to be very careful not to create implied agency. Self-represented parties. This is the new player on the block. And a self-represented party is a party to a trade that is not a client of a brokerage. And I underline a party to the trade. None of this really matters. You're not supposed to be advising or treating people as clients or treating them as a self-represented party if you're not talking to them about a trade being an offer. Okay, a self-represented party is not receiving any services from a brokerage. So once they declare as an SRP, you can assist them, but you cannot provide services from the brokerage. In effect, they can be thought of as their own agent. Agents are prohibited from providing services, opinions, or advice to an SRP or self-represented party. So you have to be very careful, even when you're out there with consumers, that you're not providing services, opinions, or advice to them, because all of a sudden they turn into an SRP and they're relying on the information that you gave them. So you must be very careful. And I'm going to put a caveat in here that we're going to talk a little bit more about creating buyer representation agreements and how important that is going to be moving forward. Agents are prohibited from encouraging an SRP or self-represented party to rely on you, the agent's knowledge, skill, or judgment. And an agent can provide assistance to an SRP, provided it does not create implied agency. And also, if you're providing assistance to an SRP, an agent must have a client to the trade, either a buyer or seller. That is the only time that when someone declares as an SRP or self-represented party, the only time you can help them or assist them is if they are doing an offer with your client. So that's a little bit about the basics of an SRP. When you're dealing with an SRP, you have to verify that the consumer intends to be an SRP. So what you're doing is asking them if they're going to be self-represented. If they're not, or they're humming and hawing and not quite clear on what that means, or what they're going to do, remember to continue to treat them as a consumer and not get too involved in giving them information. Be very careful not to give them advice, because if they do turn SRP, then hopefully they're not relying on your advice or information. Second thing you have to do when you're dealing with somebody who says they may want to be an SRP is to provide and explain the RICO information guide, and then further to that, the RICO information and disclosure to a self-represented party. Again, we have not seen either form yet, but RICO has promised an online tool to share the guide and the SRP form. Further to that, Aaron and a couple of the technological managers, the people that know what they're doing, are going to actually probably set up an availability for you to insert a link to the RICO guide and information guide, and the information guide and the SRP form. They'll probably set up a link to that, and you'll be able to pop that right into your email signature. That way it's going to be easier to share. You won't have to go to the RICO website and share it from there. But we're working on, as soon as we see how RICO is going to deliver this, we will come up with a solution for you so that you have it at your fingertips to be able to pass it on to consumers and be able to explain it to them. The third thing when you're dealing with an SRP is you're going to have to attempt to obtain an acknowledgement from them that they are going to be an SRP. AREA's working with a realtor has been revamped so that when you're doing a trade and an SRP is involved in the trade, part of the working with a realtor will have a spot for the SRP to acknowledge that they are representing themselves. Okay. You can, number 4, only provide assistance to an SRP that is a service to your client, is in the best interests of your client, and consistent with the client's legal instructions. Remember that the SRP is representing himself, and you are working in the best interests of your client. So when you're talking to an SRP, there are certain things that you absolutely have to communicate to an SRP. And you've got to communicate that you, the agent, represents your client and your client's best interests. They have to be told that. You also have to tell them that you, the agent, does not represent the SRP. They're flying solo. They are not being represented by an agent. Agents cannot provide services, opinions, or advice to an SRP. This is something you have to communicate to them and make them understand that you cannot provide services, opinions, or advice. Assistance provided to an SRP must benefit the client. You have to tell them that. If they're representing themselves, you have to say, with all due respect, sir, you're representing yourself, and any assistance I give you must be a benefit to my own client. That is our duty in agency. Agent duties to the client require sharing of any SRP confidential information. You have to inform the SRP that anything they tell you that is considered confidential, whether it is their motivation for buying or anything about their financial background, all of that has to be shared with your client. Okay, so your SRP has to be informed of those things. Now, you can assist an SRP. If they are in a trade with your client, you can assist them, but any assistance must be a service to your client. So if you're handing them a CMA, that can be considered a service to your client. Any assistance must be in your client's best interests, and any assistance must be free of advice or opinions. So that's the type of assistance you can give. And when you're doing that, when you are assisting an SRP, the agent must ask themselves, can I provide assistance without the SRP relying on my skill, knowledge, or judgment? Okay, so these are things that you do have to be careful of when you are dealing with an SRP. So when we are dealing with SRPs, customers which are no longer existent, consumers, which is the general public now, or clients who are under contract with us, these are just things that have come up in discussion. You can provide general real estate information to any person or, excuse me. So when you're out dealing with the public, you can, of course, give them a general outline of how real estate works, what you do, what they need to do if they want specific assistance, how they become a client, what your marketing is, what services you provide. Consumers asking general questions or prospective clients, buyers or sellers, they're not SRP, they are consumers. And until they declare, that's exactly what they are. You can provide them with your marketing plans, CMAs, or outline your BRA services. So yes, if you do not have, let's say you're called in on a listing appointment. You go in there, you provide a CMA, you provide your marketing plan, and you are showing the person how you're going to represent them if you get their listing. The same with when you're dealing with a consumer and you bring them into the office or you meet with them and you tell them all about your buyer representation agreement services and how you work under contract. Okay? You can provide that information. You must be careful when dealing with consumers not to create implied agency. And you must be honest and work under the RICO Code of Ethics. So you have to be honest with the public, but you're not giving out any confidential information about your client that you represent. You're not giving opinions or advice to people until they're under contract with you. You cannot show SRP's property that is not listed by you. This is not a service to your client. However, if the person is not an SRP and they are just a consumer, yes, you can show them property, but why would you until you have them under a BRA as a client? You can show consumers properties, but be careful not to create implied agency. So when you're out showing, you be very careful about giving advice about the property you're showing, because if you say to them, this property is overpriced, and they turn into an SRP before they do an offer and start relying on your advice, you have created implied agency with them and you can be held accountable for it. So you must be careful. And my final point is please watch for training within the next month or so by Aaron. He's going to be doing presentations on how to sharpen your buyer presentation skills, because it's becoming increasingly important to have a consumer sign a BRA with you, even if it's only for one specific property. And I must caution you that when you are out dealing with the public, especially under the new Tresa, you have got to be cognizant of the fact that as agents, we work under agency and representation agreements. You can't be out there just flying by, oh, I hope the public signs something with me before we do an offer, because that's no longer good enough. You have to have your way of dealing with the public in a way that is professional, and you have to understand what you're doing out there. This is going to be a transition. The public is going to be totally unaware of how things have changed. It's going to be up to us as realtors to explain things to them, and it's going to take time. The transition is going to take time, and I'm not here to scare everyone. We're going to work through it, and we'll take up situations one by one, and we will find out the best way to handle them. There is a transition period, and until then, we're going to be investigating further questions, etc. And then we're going to start drilling down into designated representation and multiple representation and what's required of both of those.